All right, my friends, it took quite a bit, but we finally got through all the setup of Flutter on our local machine, and we've also generated our first starting project. We're going to dive into that first project in just a moment, but before we do, I want to have a quick discussion and give you a better idea of exactly how we work with Flutter. In other words, when we write Flutter applications, what are we doing all day? All right, so a couple items here. So in order to make a Flutter application, you and I are going to spend a lot of time building something called widgets. We create widgets to represent elements that are displayed on the screen of our mobile device. A widget is just a fancy term for a Dart class that represents something that's going to show up on the screen. So all the knowledge that we've just acquired about Dart classes and methods and instance variables are all 100% applicable to what we're going to be doing with Flutter. In order to build complex applications, you and I are going to spend a lot of time developing reusable widgets, or in other words, widgets that can be used several times throughout one given application or even shared with other apps that we might develop. Some of the widgets that you and I are going to use are provided to us for free by Flutter. So a lot of very basic widgets like, say, displaying a piece of text or showing an image or showing a button are all included out of the box with Flutter. But there's going to be other sets of widgets or other types of widgets that you and I are going to want to customize a little bit. So some widgets are going to be provided by Flutter, some are going to be created by you and me. Okay, so at this point I've been using the term widget quite a bit, and you're probably a little bit curious about, well, what exactly is a widget? Let's take a look at a very practical example of how we might design a widget and make use of some that are created by Flutter and make use of some that might be created by you and me. So I want you to take a look at this mock-up right here for maybe some type of, I don't know, to-do application. Inside this application, you can see a bottom navigation bar where we can kind of navigate between different screens. At the very top, we've got a header of sorts that says, hey, you're looking at all of your to-dos. And then maybe we've got a couple of buttons up here at the top as well that allows our user to filter through to-dos for all time, just today, and tomorrow. And then finally, maybe we've got some button on here as well that a user can press to add a new to-do. So if we were building this application with Flutter, we would try to write very little code. And in general, we tried to reuse as many widgets as we possibly can. So just about everything that you see on the screen right here can be built without you and I having to write a lot of custom code. Instead, we can make use of a lot of the widgets that are built into Flutter itself to build a UI like this. Let me show you exactly how. I'm going to open up the Flutter documentation at flutter.io, and I'm going to go to /widgets, which takes me to the official widgets catalog. So this is a list of all the default widgets that are included for us for free along with Flutter. You can certainly scroll through here and take a look at some of the different ones, but to build an application that looks like this right here, I might take a look at this material components section. And then inside of material components, I'll find the widget called scaffold. So the scaffold widget is a general layout widget. It gives us a lot of very common patterns that are used in a lot of material design applications. So we can take a look at the documentation here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how the scaffold class works. But there's something much more in particular I want to show you here. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit, and I'm going to find the constructor section right here. So we know a lot about constructors now because we spoke about them in the deck application we put together, and we also spoke about those things called named parameters. So when we create a scaffold widget, we can pass in a ton of different named parameters. We can pass in a name parameter called, what you see right here, an app bar. We can pass in something called a floating action button, and we can also pass in something called a bottom navigation bar. So in order to build an application exactly like this right here, we might create a scaffold by calling its constructor, and then for the app bar component or the app bar parameter, for the floating action button parameter, and for the bottom navigation bar parameter, we will create and assign widgets. So we might do something like this right here. At the very top, we would create a new widget called an app bar. We could create a tab bar to represent these buttons. We could create a floating action button to represent this button right here, and a bottom navigation bar for the set of buttons at the bottom as well. We can create each of those, and then all we have to do is pass them in to this scaffold when we create it. The scaffold class, or the scaffold widget, will automatically take all those widgets we have provided and lay them out on the screen for us in this sort of layout. So this layout right here is what that scaffold class is meant to do for us automatically. All we got to do is create a new scaffold, we pass in some set of widgets that you and I create, and ta-da, they all get placed in the right spot on the screen automatically for us. So that's what you and I are going to spend a lot of time doing with Flutter. We're going to create sets of widgets of our own. We're going to look at a lot of documentation for some of these widgets that we get out of the box with Flutter, and we're going to figure out how we can leverage all of these built-in widgets to very quickly make our own customized application. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a preview of what we're going to be doing. So let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to continue the next section and talk about the first app that we're going to put together. In the last section, we spoke a little bit about how we create Flutter applications. So remember, you and I are going to be creating a bunch of widgets, and then we assemble them together to get our desired application. In general, there's a tremendous number of widgets included with Flutter that we can leverage to build some really interesting applications quite quickly. In this section, we will continue by talking about the first application we're going to be putting together. So let's take a look at a mockup. Okay, so here's the general idea. We're going to build an application that will show a list of images to our users. When a user first boots up our application, we'll show them the screen over here at the left-hand side. So by default, nothing is displayed on the screen. There's going to be a button at the bottom right-hand side, and if a user presses on this thing, then we will show a single image to the user, like what you see here in the middle. We'll show the image, and then right underneath it, we'll show some relevant title for the image as well. If a user then presses on this button again, we're going to add another image to that list. And then for however many times the user presses this button, we're going to add an additional image each and every time. So along the process, we're going to learn quite a bit about handling images, we're going to learn about building lists, and we're also going to learn a little bit about fetching data off the internet. Because the list of images that we're going to display here are not going to be saved on our hard drive or anything like that. We're going to instead fetch a list of images off the internet. And then every time a user presses a button, we'll show an additional image that we have fetched. Okay, so that's the general idea. There's definitely going to be a good set of challenges inside of here. So let's continue, but before we do, let's make sure that we start up our emulator and make sure that we're all ready to start working on this application. So I'm going to make sure that I'm inside of my pics directory, which is the name of the project we just generated. And then inside this, I'm going to run flutter run, like so. And then I should see my application appear inside my emulator very shortly. All right, so I'm going to let that do its startup, and then we'll come back in the next section, and we'll talk about how we're going to build this application. At the end of the last section, we started up our sample application inside of our emulator. So now you should see the default counter application that tells you how many times you've pressed some given button, and you can click on the button and see that count increment. Now I've taken the liberty of also starting up my code editor inside that pics directory as well, and so I encourage you to pause the video right now and make sure you start up your code editor too. Once you get your code editor open, you're going to find a collection of different files and folders inside of our pics directory. We're going to start to explore some of these different files and folders over time, but for right now, we're going to be 100% focused on exactly one very specific folder, and that is the lib directory. So 99% of all the code that you and I write to build Flutter applications is going to be placed inside of this lib directory. Every lib directory that you're going to work with is always going to have a main.dart file inside of it. The main.dart file is very special. It's the first file that gets loaded up and executed when our application is ran inside of our mobile device. So we need to make sure that we always have one file called main.dart inside the lib directory. Now we can certainly have other files inside of here as well, but at a minimum, we have to have a main.dart file. If you now open up this file, you'll see that there's a tremendous amount of code already inside of here. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to learn things from scratch, and I don't really like using a lot of pre-generated code. So rather than trying to work with all this stuff, I'm going to highlight all that code and delete it, like so. So we'll start completely fresh, and we'll get a really good idea of how to build up an application from scratch. Now, I'm sure you're very excited to get started on this application right here, but there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve to get to this point. So rather than trying to just beeline fetching some images and showing them on the screen, I think we should set a little bit more realistic short-term goal. Let's say that for right now, we'll just try to get some very plain content to appear on the screen of our device. So on the screen of our emulator over here. In other words, let's just try to get some very plain text to show up. So in order to get some text to show up, I'm going to go back over to my main.dart file, and then inside of here, I'm going to lay out a couple of comments that are going to guide me through the process of getting some content to appear on the screen. So I'm going to lay out 4 separate comments that are going to walk us through exactly what we have to do. At the very top, I'm going to add a comment that says that I need to import a helper library from Flutter to get content on the screen. So that's going to be step 1. We're going to have to import some code into our project. And we'll talk exactly about what an import statement is doing for us in just a moment. But first, let's continue on with a couple more comments. So the second thing we need to do is define a main function to run when our app starts. So just as before, back inside of Dartpad, where we said we have to define a main function, which is the first function that gets ran inside of our program, same is true as of Flutter as well. So every Flutter app that we build is always going to have exactly one main function defined inside of it. And that main function will be executed for us automatically. Then inside of that main function, we're going to do 2 additional steps. First, we're going to create a new text widget to show some text on the screen. And then finally, we're going to take that widget and get it on the screen. So creating the text widget, or creating something that's going to show some information on the screen, is a slightly different process than actually taking that thing and telling our mobile device to put it on the screen. 2 separate things. On the one hand, we have to first create the widget, and then the second step is to actually get it on the screen of our device. Okay, so that's the 4 steps that we're going to go through. So let's take a pause right here. We'll come back in the next section, and we're going to start on these 4 steps. In the last section, we wrote out 4 comments to guide us through the process of getting some content to show on the screen of our device. In this section, we're going to tackle step number 1, which is to import some code into our project so that we can actually work with our mobile device and get some content to show up. So before we write any code for this, I want to tell you a little bit more about how import statements work. All right, so quick diagram right here. Okay, so in the very center of this diagram is our application. And right now, our entire application consists of just the main.dart file. Outside of our application, we have access to a ton of different code. So we have access to the entire Dart standard library, which we took a little bit of a glance at the documentation for. And we also have the entire Flutter standard library as well, which includes a lot of default widgets and things to help us build out mobile applications. In order to get access to any of this code inside of our application, we have to first import it into our project, or more specifically, import it into the file that we're working on. So if I want to say import a file from the Flutter standard library into my main.dart file, I have to write out an import statement that tries to specifically go into the Flutter standard library package, find some module inside of here, and then specifically add that module to my main.dart file. Now there's some very specific syntax around this. So let's flip back over to our code editor. We're going to add our import statement, and then we'll talk about how that syntax works. All right, so underneath this first comment, I'm going to write out import. I'm then going to put a set of single quotes. I'll say package :flutter / material.dart, like so. Okay, so that's our first import statement. Now, before we talk about the exact syntax of this import statement, I want to let you know one very important thing here. In Dart, there are 3 different types of import statements. The syntax around the import statement is going to change slightly depending upon where we are importing code from. So what you're seeing right here is how we write an import statement to import code from a third-party package. If we're writing an import statement to import code from the Dart standard library, or to import code from a file that you and I have written inside of our project directory, then this syntax is going to change just a little bit. So this is one form of syntax, and very shortly we'll see those other two forms as well. Okay, so now let's break down the syntax right here and talk about what's going on. All right, here we go. So here's that entire line of code broken down step by step. So the first word, I think you get a good sense of what's going on there. It's an import keyword. It's telling Dart we want to import some other file into this one. Then inside of that string is where things start to get really interesting. So the first word is package and then a colon. The word package specifically tells Dart that we're trying to import code from a third-party library that has been installed into our project. If we are importing code from the Dart standard library or from a file that you and I wrote, then we're not going to have this word there, but we'll talk more about those import statements later on when we actually make use of them. After we write out package and then our colon, we then place the name of the library that we want to import code from. So in this case, we're trying to import some code from the Flutter library. We then place a slash and then the name of the file that we're trying to import. So in this case, we're trying to import the material.dart file from the Flutter library. Now, this last part right here might seem a little bit scary. You might be thinking, well, Stephen, how will I know what file I want to import from this library? And for that, don't sweat it. The documentation for the for the library that you're using is always going to tell you more or less exactly what file you want to import into your project. So in general, if you read the documentation, you're going to have a good idea of exactly what file you're trying to import. Okay, so that's what's going on with this line of code right here. So now that we've imported this file into our project, which has some helpers to get content on the screen, we'll continue in the next section where we'll define our main function and then continue on with the rest of our steps. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we added an import statement to our main.dart file, and we had a brief discussion of what it's doing for us. We're now going to continue on to step 2, where we define our main function. So inside of here, I'm going to write out our main function absolutely identical to how we wrote it out previously back over in Dartpad. So I'm going to write out void main, a set of parentheses, and then my curly braces like so. Now remember, this means that the name of the function is main, and the void word right here means that we are returning nothing from this function. Now steps 3 and 4 are going to be done inside of our main function. So I'm going to take both those comments, and I'm going to paste them inside the main function like so. Okay, that looks better. Okay, so now inside of our main function, we're going to move directly on to step number 3. So we need to create a text widget in order to show some text on the screen. To do this, I'm going to first write out a new variable that I will call simply app. And then inside or assigning to this, I'm going to create a brand new instance of a widget, and I'm going to assign it to that variable. So I'm going to say material app is the name of the widget that I'm trying to create, and then I'm going to pass it exactly one named parameter. So I'm going to write out a named parameter of home, and I'm going to assign to that named parameter a text widget. And to the text widget, I'm going to pass in the text that I ultimately want to show on the screen of my mobile device. So for me, I'm just going to say, hi there, like so. Okay, so before we talk too much about what a material app is, or what text is, or what this home thing is right here, there's one quick thing I want to tell you about, and this is something that is going to just haunt your days for as long as you're building Flutter applications. So if you have code that looks identical to mine right here, I want you to save the file. Now when you save the file, you might see something like that happen. You might see your code automatically collapse. So when we are working on Flutter projects, if you're using Visual Studio Code is going to try to reformat your code every single time you save the file. Sometimes it's going to collapse your code to what you see right here. It's going to collapse it to be in as few lines as possible. But very often when we're building Flutter applications, we want everything to be indented, or we want to have a little bit of vertical structure so that we can more easily read our code. However, if you just save the file, it's always going to collapse itself. So in order to keep our code in this more vertical fashion, which is much easier to read, we're going to put a comma at the end of that line. The comma right here makes sure that this line does not collapse. So if I now save the file, it does not collapse anymore. Now, this might seem like a very small distinction right now, but over time, we're going to end up with some very heavily nested function calls. And you're going to want to make sure that those stay on separate lines so that it maintains its legibility. So in practice, I'm going to be adding on commas to the end of many lines of code that we put together, and I'll do my best to point them out just to make sure that you get a better idea of how they work. Okay, so now a little bit more onto what's going on with the code. With these 3 lines of code right here, we are creating an instance of a Dart class, or what we call a widget, that creates a material app widget. A material app widget is kind of like a very core level widget of our application. When we create a material app, it automatically sets up a lot of functionality inside of our application for us, such as the ability to navigate between different screens inside of our application. So it is somewhat common to see one of the very core or root widgets of your application be a material app because it sets up a lot of very default functionality that many different apps need out of the box. When we create the material app, we pass in a named parameter of home. The named parameter of home is used as the default route or the default widget to show on the screen when the application first starts up. So home right here, you can think of as meaning like home screen or home widget. It's the first thing that's going to show up when our application first boots up. Then to the home parameter, we are assigning a text widget. A text widget does exactly what you might think it does. It gets some text to show up on the screen, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so that's this line of code right here. Let's again take a very quick pause. We're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to take that widget we just created and assign to this app variable right here, and we're going to get it to show up on the screen of our mobile device. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we created a new instance of a material app and assigned it to this app variable right here. We're now going to take this app variable, which contains a reference to our material app, and we're going to try to get it to display on the screen of our device. So fortunately, this step is very straightforward. When we import this material.dart file right here, it included not only this material app thing and this text thing, but it also included an import for a function called run app as well. So I'm going to write out the run app function down here. And then to this function, I'm going to pass in the app that we just created. So the run app function is going to take the app widget that we just made, and it's going to try to get that widget to display on the screen of our mobile device. So now we can save this file. I'm going to open up my emulator once more. I'm going to open up my terminal once more. And then you might notice that inside of our terminal, we get a message right here that says that we can reload our app on the fly by pressing R, or we can restart our app entirely by pressing capital R or Shift R on your keyboard. So the pressing of R or capital R is talking about having your terminal focused and then pressing those hotkeys. So if you go over to the simulator or your emulator and you just press R, nothing's going to happen. You have to go over to your terminal, and then you're going to press Shift R, and that's going to take all the changes we just made to our code base. It's going to rebuild our app and then restart the application on our simulator or emulator. So when I hit Shift R over here, I then very soon see the text "Hi there" appear on my screen. Now this text very unfortunately looks absolutely hideous right now. It's got some pretty weird formatting around it, but I think you can agree with me that at least we got some content to appear on the screen, or more specifically, this text widget right here that has the text "Hi there." Okay, so that's it. We got some very simple content to show up on our screen. However, I think you can agree with me that, yeah, we probably are going to have to work on the styling here just a little bit if we're going to actually work on the application that we're trying to put together. This one right here. So let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next video, and we're going to start working on some more functionality to really make our app. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we got some content to display on the screen of our device, but yeah, it doesn't look that great. So in this section, we're going to start looking at a lot of Flutter documentation and get a better idea of how we can build out a nice looking app like the one that we're trying to build. So let's get to it. I'm going to first get started by going back over to my main.dart file. Now, just to keep the code inside of here a little bit more legible, I'm going to delete the comments that I had added. So if you want to keep your comments around, Totally fine. I'm just going to remove them so that you can see the code that I'm writing a little bit more easily. Okay, and there we go. So now we're ready to add some more code to this file. All right, before we do, I want to take one more quick look at our mockup over here. So inside of our mockup, we've got this sort of header thing at the top, and then we've got that kind of floating action button down here, and then we, at some point in time, show some content on the body of the screen. So like I had said earlier, when we try to build Flutter apps, we spend a lot of time looking at the Flutter documentation, more specifically, the documentation around the default widgets that we get for free when we make use of Flutter. So let's go take another look at the Flutter documentation around all those included widgets, and we'll see if there's not some widget out there that is going to help us achieve this kind of layout, where we have this header at the top and the button down here. So I'm going to again pull up my Flutter documentation, which I can reach at flutter.io/widgets. This is the widgets catalog, which we looked at just a couple of videos ago. I'm going to open up the material components section again. And as you might guess, we're going to again look at this scaffold widget. So on the scaffold widget, I'm going to open up documentation, and we'll get a better sense of how to put this thing together. So if we want to show a scaffold widget on the screen, we can create a new scaffold and then pass in some of these different other widgets. Now I'm going to zoom in here for just a moment so we can see this more easily. I know that this list of widgets right here probably looks very, very overwhelming at first glance. And I'll tell you, one of the hardest parts of getting used to Flutter is just the sheer number of widgets and different classes that are made available to you. There's an absolute learning curve here, as you're going to have to spend some of your own time looking at the official documentation and building apps and making use of all these default classes to get a better idea of what is available to you. Definitely this Flutter catalog of widgets is helpful, but it only goes so far. So it's going to take a little bit of practice on our part. So essentially, to build out this sort of layout that we're going after, where we've got the header up top and the button down here, we're going to create an instance of our scaffold class, and then we're going to create an app bar, which is going to represent that horizontal bar at the very top of our app. And then we're also going to create a floating action button, which is a circular button shown on the bottom right corner of the app. So we're going to essentially create 3 widgets in total. We're going to make an instance of the scaffold, an instance of an app bar, an instance of a floating action button, and then we're going to wire them all up together. So let's flip back over to our code editor and get started on this process. Okay, so back over here, at present, our application is showing a text widget. Now we probably don't want to show the text widget at all times, so I'm going to remove that to start. I am going to leave behind our material app, because we definitely want all that very basic functionality that is included in a material app, such as what we had mentioned before, the ability to navigate between different screens. Now, our application in particular doesn't require any navigation, but in general, you're going to end up using a material app anyways for any app that needs any amount of navigation, so I'm just going to leave this in here for now. Then, inside of this named home parameter, you'll remember whatever we pass in here is going to be the first widget that is shown on the screen. I'm going to create a new scaffold widget. Now, as we just saw, we're going to have to create and pass a couple of different widgets to the scaffold. And so I'm going to put a new line inside of here to give myself a little bit of space. Then we're going to create an app bar. And if I go to my constructor section again and find my scaffold section, we can see that if we create an app bar, we can assign that to the named parameter of app bar on the scaffold itself. So in short, we want to write out inside the scaffold app bar, and that's going to be an app bar component. And then I'll put a comma at the end of the line so that I can save this file and the code will not collapse. Remember, if I omit these commas, then the code is going to collapse when I save the file, although that does depend upon your code editor. Okay, so there's our app bar. So let's now save this, oops, with the comma in there. Oh, one more time. No, come on. There we go. So I'm now going to save this file. We're going to refresh our emulator one more time and see what we get on the screen now. So I'm going to first pull up my emulator. I'm going to pull up my terminal, and remember to refresh our app, we can press Shift-R on our keyboard. So I'll hit Shift-R. That will restart my application. And ta-da! That's the result of our scaffold component. So the scaffold component gets this nice white background on the screen, and then the app bar component, or the app bar widget, gets this blue bar up here at the very top. Now at present, the blue bar is totally empty, and it doesn't appear that there's like any text inside of here. So let's take a quick break, we'll come back to the next section, and we'll figure out how we can add some text to that app bar. In the last section, we got our scaffold and our app bar widgets to show up on the screen. However, the app bar widget is not currently showing any text. And if you look back at our mockup for the app we're trying to build, we definitely showed some text inside the app bar. So in this section, we're going to figure out how we add some text. I'm going to first get started by pulling up the documentation for the app bar on the Flutter documentation page. So here's where we were looking at the scaffold class. To pull up the documentation for the app bar, you can either find the link just a little bit down right here, or you could go to the search interface on the top right-hand side and search for app bar class. So I'll go to the app bar documentation. On the right-hand side, you're going to see that the app bar has a lot of documentation very similar to all the documentation we saw back when we were looking at that list class that was a part of the Dart standard library. So the app bar is a widget, but it's still a Dart class. So it has its own set of properties, and it has its own set of methods as well. In order to get some text inside that app bar, let's take a look at the constructor and see if there's some way to assign some text to it when we first create it. So I'll scroll down a little bit. I'll find the constructor section. Here it is right here. And here's the list of all the named parameters that we can pass to the app bar constructor. If you take a real close look, you'll see that there's one particular parameter called title. So if we pass in a title for the name parameter, we can pass in some text, and that text will be used as the sort of title of our app bar. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that you'll notice that there's really nothing inside of this constructor documentation that says, oh yeah, the title property is what's used for getting some text into the app bar, right? There's nothing in that constructor documentation that says, here's how you get a title here. So how would we know that's how we're supposed to get a title in there? Well, honestly, again, this comes down to experience with using the app bar class. You can also take a look at some of the documentation up here at the top. In particular, this diagram right here, that will tell you, oh yeah, here's where that title gets used. And if you read through all this stuff right here, somewhere it will probably also tell you, yeah, pass in a text widget for the title property, and that's how you get some text to show on the screen. So a lot of this stuff around Flutter, I can't say it enough. I said it in the last section, I'll say it again now. It really comes down to reading the documentation closely. Throughout this course, I'll definitely give you a lot of very distinct pointers on where to look, but in general, I'm going to do my best to show you how we read this documentation to figure out exactly what's going on. Okay, so now that we know how to make use of this app bar class to get some text to show up, I'll flip back over to my code editor. I'm going to find where we are creating that app bar widget. I'm going to expand that parentheses, and then I'm going to pass in a named parameter of title. And I'm going to assign to that a text widget with the text, what did we want to say? What was the mockup? Let's see some images. Okay, so in those quotes, we'll do, let's see some images, like so. And then again, I'll put a comma at the end of the line so that this line does not collapse. Okay, so then I'll save this. I'll pull open my emulator. I will restart my app. And I will then see that new text appear inside the app bar. All right, looks good. So we're making a little bit of progress. Let's come back to the next section, and we'll continue by trying to get this action button down here to appear on the right bottom hand side of the screen. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we got some text to show up inside of our app bar at the top of the screen. We're now going to move on to making sure that we get a button that our users can press on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen as well. Let's first take a look at the documentation for our scaffold class and see if there's anything in there that can help us with putting this button on the screen at the proper location, specifically down here at the bottom right. So I'm going to go back over to my Flutter documentation. I've already navigated back over to the scaffold class. If you've navigated away, remember you can always search for scaffold on the top right-hand side. Once I'm at the scaffold class, I'm going to scroll down to the constructor again. So I'll go down, down, down. Here's my scaffold constructor. Right now, you and I are only making use of the named parameter of appBar. So back inside of our code editor, we had created our scaffold, and we created an appBar widget and assigned it to that named appBar parameter. So now to get a button on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, we're going to create a second widget and assign it to this floating action button parameter right here. If we pass in a widget on this floating action button name parameter, the scaffold widget will automatically take that widget and display it at the bottom right-hand side, which is exactly what you and I are trying to do. Now, the other thing I want to mention here before we go away from the documentation, I'm going to scroll up just a little bit to this list of widgets right here. One of the widgets that you'll see listed is a widget called Floating Action Button. So we looked at the documentation for this, or at least this line, a couple of videos ago. This widget will display a circular button that is typically shown in the bottom right corner of the screen. So if we create a new widget called the Floating Action Button, and we assign it to that name parameter of Floating Action Button, presumably we're going to get our button at the bottom right-hand side. So let's try this out right now. I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. I'm going to find my scaffold widget, and I'm going to pass in an additional named parameter. So I'll say floating action button, and then I'm going to assign to that a widget of floating action button, like so. Okay, so right here, I want to take a quick pause just to clear up a little bit of confusion that you might have right now. There's two things about this line of code and this line of code that might be a little bit confusing right now. So the first thing you might be curious about is how are we able to make reference to something called floating action button and appBar when we clearly have not defined those inside this file? So we are able to reference appBar and floating action button because they were added to the scope of this file for free when we added that import statement at the top of the file. So the floating action button, the appBar, and for that matter, material app, scaffold, and text were all imported into our application thanks to this import statement up here. That's why we are able to reference these different classes. Now the second thing you might be a little bit curious about is the distinction between this name of floating action button and the word floating action button over here. So let's clear that up as well. On the left-hand side, we wrote out floating action button with a lowercase f because we are passing that as a named parameter to the scaffold widget right here. So we were just 2 seconds ago, we were looking at the documentation for the scaffold constructor. And this documentation said, oh yeah, you can pass me a floating action button parameter. And if you do, I'll do my best to show that on the screen for you. So that's why we added in floating action button right here. Then to specify exactly what widget we wanted the scaffold to show when it tried to show something on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, we passed in the floating action button over here, which is the name of another widget that is provided to us for free by Flutter. So that's why you're seeing these kind of duplicate names right here. They don't have to be identical. It just happens that that is how Flutter decided to name these things. The one on the left is tied to the scaffold class. The one on the right is the name of a unique widget that can be used to display a button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Whew, okay. So hopefully that clears up possibly a little bit of confusion. Now you'll notice that if I hover over this green squiggly right here, I get this little warning and it says the parameter of onPress is required. So let's take a quick pause right here. We'll continue in the next section and we'll figure out exactly what that error message or what that little warning means. At the end of the last section, we added in this floating action button widget right here, but if we hover over it, you'll see that there's a little bit of a warning that says the parameter onPress is required. Let's take a look at the documentation around floating action button and see if we can't get a better idea of what's going on. So I'm going to go back over to my Flutter documentation, and again on the top right hand side, I'll look up floating action button. And then once I pull up the documentation for that class, I'll scroll down to the constructor. Okay, so here's the floating action button constructor. Inside the list of all these named parameters, you'll notice that there's one called onPressed right here. And that's exactly what that warning message was complaining about. Now right in front of onPressed, you'll notice that there's this thing called @required. @required right here, as you might guess, means that we are required to pass in some value for this onPressed property. So if we create a floating action button, we have to pass in a value for onPressed. So let's first just add in that name property, and then we'll figure out what value we're going to pass into it. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to expand the floating action button. I'll add in onPressed, and then we'll just leave it right there. We're going to go back over to the documentation very quickly and figure out what we need to assign to this. Okay, so back over here, the type of onPressed says that it is supposed to be a void callback. Well, I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of scary. Well, let me give it to you in very simple English. Essentially, we have to pass in a function to this onPressed property. Anytime the user presses on the button, the function that we pass in will be invoked. So all we have to do over here for onPressed is assign a function or create a function. So to create a function right here, I'll put my set of parentheses and then my curly braces like so. So anytime a user presses this button, this function right here is going to be executed. To test out that behavior, let's add in a print statement inside of it. So I'll say print hi there, like so. And then don't forget, we need to add a comma at the end of the function. Otherwise, the entire function will be collapsed automatically. So I'm going to put a comma right there. So let's now save this. We'll try refreshing our emulator again and seeing if we can't get this print message to display if we tap on that button. So I'll pull open my terminal. I'll hit Shift-R again to reload our application. Now I see a button on the bottom right-hand side. It looks like the button is just a very plain blue button, and it's not currently showing that kind of plus inside of it that we had wanted. So we're going to have to do a little bit of work on that front, but let's see if we can press it and see that print statement appear. So if I click on the button, sure enough, we see hi there inside of our terminal. Okay, well, that definitely works out. So let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next section, and we're going to figure out how we can get that little plus icon to display inside the button as well. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. We now have our button displaying on the screen, and when we press it, we see a print statement inside of our terminal, which is definitely interesting, but the button itself does not have any icon inside of it. So we're going to have to figure out how we somehow are going to get that plus symbol to appear inside of here. So the first thing I want to do is take a look at the floating action button documentation one more time. I'll go back over to my floating action button class right here, and then back down inside the constructor, I'll find the list of named parameters. Now inside the list of parameters, you'll notice one called child right here. This is a name parameter that you're going to get very, very familiar with. So there's a tremendous number of Flutter widgets that you and I are going to use that accept some child widget. If we pass in a widget to this child parameter, then the floating action button is going to attempt to show that widget inside of itself. Or in this case, essentially show whatever we pass into the child parameter inside of the button. And that's how we're going to get that plus symbol to show up. All we have to do is pass in something to child. Now this child parameter is not unique to the floating action button. Like I said, you're going to find that there are many, many other widgets that expect to be called with a child property. And if we pass one in, that widget will try to show whatever we passed in inside of itself. So I'm going to go back over to my code editor. I'll find my floating action button right here. And then as an additional name parameter, I'll add in child. And then for right now, let's try passing in some text. And we'll just do a plus. and I'll put a comma at the end of that line. Okay, so I'll save this. I'll pull open my emulator. I'll restart the application. And how are we doing? Okay, so we got the plus inside there. But you'll notice that that seems like an awfully small little plus symbol. I think it could definitely stand to be a little bit bigger. So let's take a quick pause right here, and we'll try to get a better sense of whether or not we're taking this little plus symbol right here the correct way or not. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we got our little plus button to show up right here, but that plus is very small and definitely pretty hard to see. So to fix this issue, we're going to find our child name parameter on our floating action button right here, and rather than showing a text widget, we're going to replace it with a widget that shows an actual plus icon. Let's take a look at the documentation around icons and get a better idea of how we work with them. All right, so inside my browser, I'm going to search for the icon class. We want specifically icon, singular. So we'll look at the documentation for this. I'm going to scroll on down to our constructor function. Here it is right here. You'll notice that this constructor function has a kind of interesting signature to it. So on a lot of the other widgets we've looked at so far, they all took named parameters. And remember, a named parameter is indicated by the presence of those curly braces. So here's the opening curly brace, and here's the closing one right here. But in this case, the icon class takes a positional argument as well. So the icon class always expects that you call it with a first argument, the icon that you want to actually show. And then in addition to that first argument, you can optionally provide some number of named parameters. Now, that might sound a little bit confusing, but we'll see a better example of this later on with another widget that we're going to use inside this course. In this particular case, we don't really care about any of these named parameters. We only care about the first argument. So this is not the best place to go into this in more detail. But again, we'll talk about it a little bit later. So in order to show an icon, we're first going to place an icon widget. And then as the first argument, we're going to specify which actual icon we want to show. That might sound confusing, so let's try writing out the code for it, and you'll get a better idea of what's going on. I'm going to go back over to my code editor. I'm going to find that existing text widget, and I'm going to replace it with icon instead. So by just writing out icon, that is telling Flutter that we want to show an icon here. But just writing out icon doesn't actually indicate which icon we want to show. Flutter has access to a huge collection of different icons, so we need to be very specific and say, hey, here's the icon that we're trying to show right here. So as the first argument, to specify which icon we want to show, we're going to write out icons. Notice that in this case we have an S right there, dot add. Okay, so I'm not going to say anything about this just yet. Let's just save this. We're going to refresh our simulator and see how we're doing. So if I do a Shift-R to do a hot restart, watch the little button down here, and when the reload kicks in, you're going to notice that it just got a little bit bigger. So that's definitely a more appropriately sized plus icon for that button. Okay, so let's go back over to our code editor and talk about what this is doing right here. So again, we first place the icon widget, which just tells Flutter I want to show an icon, but it doesn't actually specify which one. To say which icon we want to show, we'd write out icons and then the name of the icon we want to use. So in this case, to show a plus icon, that icon's name is add. Let me show you a list of all the possible icons we can use, and I think the syntax right here will make a little bit more sense. So inside my browser, I'm going to open up a new tab, and you can navigate to material.io/tools/icons. Let me put that in larger text. There we go. So this has a list of all the different icons that we have access to in Flutter. So here's the icons page. And on this page, you'll see all these different icons and the name for each one right underneath it. So we just use the add icon. If we search for add inside of here, and notice there's a lot of icons with the name add inside of it. But if we go long enough, we'll eventually find that plus icon. So the plus icon is called add, and that's why we wrote out icons.add. If we wanted to instead show some other button, like say I don't know, clear right here, this X over here on the right-hand side, we could replace back inside of our widget. So instead of saying icons.add, we could instead do, what was the name? Clear. We could do icons.clear instead. So if we now do a refresh of our emulator again, the icon showed inside that button is going to change on over and be any second now. Okay, come on. It's coming, it's coming. Well, I'm sure yours has already refreshed, and I'm sure you've seen that there's going to be a big X there instead. I won't make you sit around. Oh, okay, there we go. Well, it didn't actually, there we go, finally. Well, that was definitely a little bit longer than expected, but yes, you can see that there is an X right there. So in essence, anytime that we want to show an icon, we first write out the icon class, which just says, hey, I want to show an icon. And then as the first argument to it, we specify which icon we want to show. And to do so, we write out icons dot and then the name of the icon. And any icon over on this material.io/tools/icons page is fair game inside of our application. We can use any of these icons that we wish. Okay, so that's it. Let's take a quick pause right here, and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we replaced our icon add with icon clear. I'm going to revert this back over to icons.add again, because it's definitely the actual icon we want to show inside of here. We want that plus icon. Okay, so now our application looks pretty good. We've got the app bar at the top, and we've got our floating action button at the bottom right-hand side. But there's two little issues I want to point out with our current application, at least as far as the source code goes. Right now, all of our app logic, or everything that contains the information about what we want to display on the screen, is all contained within our main function. As you might imagine, this is not how we normally design Flutter applications. Traditionally, we'll create separate files inside of our lib directory, and each separate file will contain one widget that you and I will put together. So I think that we should start thinking about how we might extract all of this logic from the main function right here into a new separate file. And that separate file will contain a widget that you and I are going to put together, whose sole purpose is to show all these other widgets. So to get started, I'm going to first create a new directory inside of my lib folder called src, short for source. Then inside the src directory, I'll make a new file called app.dart. So inside this file, we're going to create a new custom widget called the app widget. And that app widget is going to have the sole purpose for right now of showing all these other widgets that we just added to our main function. Now this is the first time that we've created our own custom widget. Up to this point, we've been reusing all these other widgets that are implemented by Flutter. So to guide us in putting together our first custom widget, we're going to write out a couple of different comments. So the first thing we need to do inside of here is import Flutter helper library. Essentially, this is the same thing that we just did inside of main.dart. We're going to add an import statement for that material.dart file. After that, we're going to create a class that will be our custom widget. Now this is kind of a two-parter. We're going to create a class that's going to be our custom widget, and one special requirement of that class is that we have to extend. Let's actually kind of write out the full comment here. We'll say this class must extend the stateless widget base class. So we'll talk about what that means in just a moment, but for right now, let's just leave that comment in. Then inside of our actual class definition, the only requirement that we have is that we must define a build method that returns the widgets that this widget will show. Okay, so that's our three big items. Well, let's get started right now with item number 1 at the top, because we pretty much already know how to take care of this one. So underneath the first comment, I'm going to add in my import statement. Now we're importing a package, we're importing a third-party library, so we're going to write out the word package. Then we'll write out the library that we're trying to import, which is Flutter, and then the name of the file that we want to import, which is material, widgets.dart. Okay, so that was the easy part. Now let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next section and we'll have a quick discussion on what all this extending the stateless widget-based class means. So quick break and I'll see you in just a minute.